So, in the realm of 20th century African vernacular photography, it is incredibly rare that we ever know the names and the stories of the people featured in the images, which is a shame because I think besides being really beautiful, stylized insights into the past, African vernacular photography, which I dare you to say 7 times really quickly, is also really special in how it's one of the first instances of Black people having control over how they're represented, especially when you remember we come from this very long running Western canon of Black people used as props, as accessories, and often depicted in ways that are either very demeaning or very marginalized, or from this very ethnographic, like anthropological angle, almost being captured and documented in the ways that you would document natural plant life and animals. And this is where you see people humanizing themselves and having control over their images and getting to really just show themselves the way that they see themselves and the way they want to be seen. You will have come across these images at least once, since they tend to go pretty viral online. I think this is because a lot of documentary photography from this time tends to be so politically oriented. What we're most used to are images of protest and struggle, which makes vernacular photography not only a welcome and an aesthetic reprieve, but also a reminder that people of the past weren't just activists and politicians or enslaved and harmed, but that they were also people just like us who cared about their hair and their clothes and their shoes. And since this was commercial photography intended for private use, a lot of the provenance around these images, like the exact dates, the names of the people, where they lived, what they did, wasn't accurately recorded or isn't incredibly well archived. So we have this unending library of these beautiful images of a bunch of anonymous people. Anonymous people. And I think we take for granted now, since we all carry these like really advanced cameras in our back pockets and we have all this cloud back storage and online media tracking everything about us. But for most of the 20th century, getting your photo taken was a very big deal. And as technology progressed, making cameras more accessible, there was an emergence of a lot of Black-owned photography studios across the continent. It was here that African culture, African style wasn't just being documented, recorded, it was being actively shaped and influenced. It was here that we get a lot of the famous Black photographers like Seydou Keita, Malik Sidibe, Jean de Parna, James Barno, and Mama Cassette, many names I have butchered. And it was here that we have a very long-running legacy of mostly male photographers, which makes Felicia Abban a very unique case. Not only is she considered one of the first African female professional photographers, but she was also the primary subject and muse of her own work. So an instance where we know the maker, we know the person in it, and we have an idea of their story. So self-portraiture is part and parcel for most artists, especially female artists, I think. But what I found most intriguing about Abban's self-portraits were also how that they were part of a very savvy marketing strategy, not unlike how a lot of influencers and content creators operate today, which I think is very valuable when you consider that she was working in the 50s, 60s, 70s, before the internet, before social media, before even just the idea of democratizing mass media. So today I wanted to share a very delightful essay I found on the life and work of Felicia Abban, which is Dress Politics and Framing Self in Ghana, the studio photographs of Felicia Abban by Dr. Lorian R. Bowles. This was published in 2016 in the journal or the book African Arts. I actually found this for free online a long time ago, so I don't remember where I got it. But if you would like to follow along or just read it in your own time, which I highly encourage, I have included it as a download for free on my Patreon, which you should be able to access in the description, and hopefully if I remember somewhere up here. This is pretty much the most comprehensive account of Abban that I have been able to find, which is bonkers considering how iconic, influential, and pioneering she was. But there just really isn't a lot of literature on her, not from an academic standpoint, not from like a pop culture, pop analysis standpoint. The most I've been able to find is a couple of like Instagram posts here and there and a few web articles. And I mean, this is a woman who had a 60-year-long career. In fact, like the first time her work was publicly exhibited was in 2016. That's like, I think by that time she was like geriatric, dude. And also what's really great about this particular essay is that it's one of the very few times that I have encountered literature on 20th century African fashion from a Black author. So Dr. Lauren R. Bowles is an American cultural anthropologist whose work focuses on women's labor and visual culture across Africa and the diaspora. A lot of the books and the articles I find tend to be from white authors. A lot of the times very well-meaning, well-intentioned, like well-researched, well-studied authors. But I do think there is going to be a level of nuance, a level of perspective, a level of significance that's missing when you are an outsider looking in. And I think you can do your best to ingratiate yourself, to understand things, but you're never really going to get that personal experience, or maybe not be able to communicate that in the way someone from there or more closely tied to it would be. So like Dr. Bowles, according to her website, has spent like over 20 years doing field work in Ghana, and she has a whole bunch of other work, if you check her website, covering similar topics. And I love that especially she's focusing on African women, because as you can see with the case of Felicia Abban, that even someone this iconic, this influential, this pioneering is so under researched or so underspoken about, and this was just very delightful, and I really hope everyone will take some time to read this. But I will be reading from most of this now. It is 10 pages long, so I'm going to skip around a few parts. There is also a bit of like heavy academic text and some things that I'm going to do my best to synthesize, and then I'll also just be adding my own commentary and like background throughout. And obviously at the end I would love to hear all your thoughts. Also, if I sound a little bit funny, I am just coming off of my third bout of flu, and I had a really bad sore throat earlier this week. So I'm going to do my best to enunciate and talk slowly and breathe, but it's a bit difficult for me now. I also have my little blue light lenses here. I just feel like that's a really good way for me to differentiate between like when I'm reading from the screen and when I'm just shooting the shit and chatting, yapping about. But yeah, so yeah, bear with me, but I am doing my best. But I think it's a really worthwhile read, and it's a really worthwhile conversation to have. And I look forward to everyone's thoughts from this. So how Dr. Ball's research began was that she was actually working on a project on West African wax print. And she initially met with Felicia Abban to talk about her husband, Robert Abban. And her husband, who had been dead at the time, had designed the commemorative cloth that featured Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's portrait for the independence celebrations in 1957. And this is really cool because the cloth that featured Kwame Nkrumah is probably one of the most famous examples of commemorative cloths ever. And it's kind of, I think, what started the sort of very big trend of sort of like independence or post-colonial like commemorative cloth traditions. You might have seen some other examples of commemorative cloth that have included really famous political figures like Nelson Mandela, Barack Obama. My favorite one features Queen Elizabeth II. They are basically like the logical extreme of how cloth has always been used as a form of communication on the continent, which I have written about before when Tebe Magugu did his own take on this a few years back, and obviously I'll link that below. But it's just very crazy that she went to go search or like do research on one very iconic like Ghanaian person in the fashion scene, and then his wife also happened to be an incredibly celebrated photographer who's considered not only Ghana but Africa's first woman professional photographer. This is like my ideal marriage, to be very honest. When I met with Abban over the next years to learn more about her life history, she always called two of her daughters to bring out fragile photographs to accompany her stories about her 60-year-long career. Worsening arthritis forced Abban into retirement 3 years ago, but the self-proclaimed forever photographer relishes in affectionate conversations about her scattered photo albums. The private collection consists mostly of studio photographs from the 1950s to 1970s, when Abban regularly produced self-portraits before she attended dinner parties and political events. Answering why she went out of her way to make self-portraits before going to town, Abban held out a photograph where she's dressed in a luxurious wax print with golden thread and exclaimed, "Because I looked good and it was good for business." Abban went on to describe the collections of self-portraits as evidentiary calling cards crafted around her own musings about the early independence period, with clothing as the central expression of her identity. Akin to a gallery of selfies stored in a cell phone, the photographs freeze the ebullient idealism of independence through the eyes of the woman photographer. In many of the photographs, Abban's attire typifies the stylistic touchstones of the 60s, with perfectly coiffed wigs and dresses with billowed sleeves. Other photographs harken to a 1950s debutante iconography, replete with pearl necklaces, floral hat, and lace gloves, while she leans her right arm over an elegant piece of classic Ghanaian kente cloth. What is consistent throughout these diverse photographs is the way in which Abban uses clothing to visibly articulate a feminine identity that plays with the traditional and contemporary in an artful hybridity that is urbane and transatlantic. The collection posits Abban within transnational publics and as part of an exhilarating period where fashioning identity was a cultural imperative. It is frequently the case that when aged African photographs circulate, whether on social media or at an art exhibit, like I had said before, the photographer or the subject's identities are unknown. As a professional photographer who worked before, during, and after independence, Abban self-portraits are an opportunity to engage intent and subject mating by photographers, particularly the way self-portraits are gendered embodiments of modernity through dress politics. Tobias Wendell examines the aesthetics of Ghanaian photography relating to posing, stature, and the intentionality of creating memory made by the choices of clothing in photography portraiture. Wendell pays particular attention to the ways in which portraits become visualized speech inscribed with classifications of ethnicity, class, and gender, where dress reinforces and illustrates social integration. With limited knowledge about the lives of African women as photographic producers, Abban's collection warrants closer consideration. Drawing on Pool's scholarship about the visual economy of photographs, as well as the complexity of object circulation in the Black Atlantic, Schneider uses the concept of the Atlantic visualscape to describe how photographs demarcate space and represent symbolic tokens of modernity that deepen our understanding about the social currency of image. This is the lens I use to examine a selection of Abban self-portraits, and I also suggest that Buckley's notion of Afro beauty is useful for this analysis. So basically, Afro beauty, she kind of goes on to describe, is this global engagement through which a modern Ghanaian identity is fashioned and then imaged by Abban through self-portraits. Drawing on oral history and an analysis of a self-portrait, I argue that Abban uses photographs to envision a feminine subjectivity in conversation with sentiments of Ghanaian nationalism alongside transnational aesthetics popularized through magazine and transnational tropes of urban chic. Abban persuasively crafts femininity, or a type of Afro beauty that celebrates her acumen as a professional photographer, while also inserting herself into conversations about Black modernity in ways that offer a visual map into how Ghanaian women embodied transcultural sentiments during the early independence period in Ghana. So sort of to kind of quickly unpack that, and also like Dr. Bowles goes much more in depth with this in the rest of the essay, but the way that Abban self-portraiture works is two parts. So on one part, she was running a business and she was using these self-portraits as kind of a way of advertising. And because of her like social position and stuff, she was showing what was the height, what was the most inspirational idea of beauty for Ghanaian women at the time. And this was a mix of like traditional textiles and like historical styles, but also mixed in with a lot of modern influences, as also Ghana was starting to shape itself and develop its own identity in the new modern world and as a post-colonial state. And then also at the same time, Abban is also putting in her own voice and her own narrative in like this idea of what a Ghanaian woman should be at the time. So it's not something that's sort of being dictated to her, or it is in part being dictated, but it's also something that she has control over. And it's something that's influenced by mass media. I think there's also quite a lot of influences from like the way African Americans were styling themselves at the time, and this idea of sort of the height of Afro beauty being this like culmination, this melting pot of all these outside influences and then all these internal ongoings. And you have on one hand this idea of nationalism and like what does it mean to be a Ghanaian woman in this post-independent state, but also like what does it mean to be a Black woman in general and a woman overall, but also like what it means to be a woman in the modern world in this increasingly globalized world. And she brings that all together with also using all of these things to also show her prowess as a photographer. So it's not just that she was capturing herself being really stylish and elegant and chic, but that she was using these as a way to show that she can take really good photos. And then that is why you'd want to be a customer of hers, because she's showing you how she can capture you through her own body. So she was acting as both like medium and message in her work. And I also do want to bring in that like commercial aspect, because I think that's quite an important part of the story, is that she wasn't really working as like an artist in the way that a lot of us think. Like she was a woman with a business, but with this very beautiful artistic mindset to it. And I think that's what made her quite popular and really successful. Felicia Abban was born in the seaside city of Sekondi, Gold Coast Colony in 1935. During British colonization, Sekondi and its adjoining city, Takoradi, were important transportation centers, as the Twin Cities held a lucrative railway junction between gold mining centers and the largest steamship port in the colony. Felicia is the eldest child and only daughter of her parents' 6 children, all of whom later became artists. Her mother was a successful trader in the boomtown, and her father, Joseph Ansa, who I'm just going to keep referring to as Joseph, they keep going by his full name and I'm not doing all that. He was a pianist and a playwright, and in the 1940s, he established his own photography studio in order to capitalize on the lucrative customer base comprising British naval officers and affluent Ghanaian families residing in the Twin Cities. Like most African photographers, young Felicia's career began with an apprenticeship at her father's Ansa studio when she was 14 years old. Felicia's interest was piqued after accompanying Joseph to a client's home and gazing at the array of Ansa studio photographs on the parlor walls. Although it was common for middle-class families to send their children to boarding school, instead, Felicia attended day school, apprenticed at the studio, and took care of her younger siblings. So she's like eldest daughter, especially eldest African daughter of note. Like, she was working a job after school, going to school, obviously, and then also taking care of her family. And also what I find quite interesting about Felicia's family, because I was doing a little bit more research, so Dr. Bowles mentions that like the rest of her siblings went on to become artists. One, I think it's not very often that you get the like couple mix where like the mom is more trade, retail, like business oriented, and then the father is the artist, which I think is quite an interesting, like nice shift in conventions. But of her brothers, like one of them went on to be a really famous Ghanaian filmmaker, and then her other brother is Kofi Ansa, who is like one of the most prolific Ghanaian designers, not just of the 20th century, but of all time. And actually his claim to fame, or like how he sort of got his big break, was that he had designed like a beaded top for Prince Anne, so that's Queen Elizabeth II's daughter, which for the life of me, I cannot find an image of online. But he's like a really influential designer, and if you ever want to look at some of his work, I know he was quite heavily featured in the Africa Fashion Exhibition, and also you can find quite a lot of images of his stuff, and he's done like beautiful bark cloth collections, really interesting twists on like kente and like different wax cloth stuff, but like really amazing prolific designer. And it's so interesting that like they all come from this one family. I also think it's really cool that they were all this family of artists, because I think especially like in the African context, you don't really get that story a lot, like this idea of like a legacy family of artists, or where that's kind of encouraged. And it's one of the instances where like I think it's really cool that she's a Nepo baby, just because it's, I think especially, or maybe this is like a South African specific thing, I don't know if maybe it's not the same thing in like West Africa, but I think especially like post-liberation, I think a lot of like Black parents come from so much economic scarcity that it is scary to let your children go into these creative fields, especially since we don't have this huge booming creative economy in Africa like you see in the West. And I think it's really cool that not only were these parents like letting their kids do that, but that they were actively encouraging it, and that they also related, and that they were also in this field. And I don't think that's something that you often hear from in the African context. I could be wrong though. During her 4-year apprenticeship, Abban learned everything from selecting studio props for backdrops, mixing chemicals, developing films, and taking photographs. Describing her father as a very particular taskmaster, Abban recalls an occasion when Joseph Ansa asked her to create half-inch white borders for several dozen 4:6 negatives. The masking of negatives' black edges with a white border was considered a sophisticated finish for print in 1951. And the white all-around borders created space for the addition of handwritten notes in the white margins. The rush job required Felicia to work through the night developing film. In her haste, Felicia accidentally cropped quarter-inch borders for all the prints, rendering them useless for the descriptive notes her father planned to add. When he noticed the mistake the following morning, her father took a handful of wasted pictures and slapped Felicia across the face with them. At her father's insistence on perfection, Felicia immediately began processing the film again. During the retelling of the story, Abban proudly remembers her father's hard lessons because she said it instilled in her a confidence about her work that carried her through the tumultuous beginnings of her career in the bristling capital of Accra. I don't think he had to hit her, but it's the 50s, I guess. By the time Felicia Ansa married the designer Robert Abban in 1953, she ran most of the financial operations and photography work at Ansa Studio. 10 years her senior, Robert was an Accra-based textile buyer who met Felicia during a business trip at the port. One afternoon, a group of businessmen standing along High Street greeted Felicia as she walked to the bank. Among them was Robert, who worked on behalf of Kwame Nkrumah's Convention's People's Party. Less than 2 weeks after cursory acknowledgements on the roadside, Robert came to Felicia's parents and asked to marry her. Well, I'm saying, ladies, if he wanted to, he would. It was considered a good match with good timing. The 17-year-old Felicia was finished with school and well equipped to run a household and a business. Robert was a rising political figure in the Popular Nationalist Party, and the Abban and Ansar families held long ties to one another in the region. Saddened that the marriage would take Felicia to Accra and away from the Sekondi studio, Joseph demanded that the couple remained engaged for a year before he offered his blessing. Another caveat required Robert to secure a long-term rental space for Felicia to open a photography studio in Accra. A few months after the wedding, Joseph was delighted when his daughter sent a photograph of her new business sign, Mrs. Felicia Abban's Day and Night Quality Art Studio. I think that's really special. I mean, it's wild that they got married after like 2 weeks of knowing each other and that she was 18, so he was like, 28? But also it's like the 50s, so I'm not going to apply a lot of like modern ideas around this. But I think it's really lovely that her father not only like recognized her talent and her acumen, but he was also like, you're not going to like rip my daughter away from her home and then make her like a housewife or a first lady type figure and like decorative arm dressing for you. You're going to secure a space for her so that she can continue doing her work, she can continue her family business, and she can have something for herself. I mean, I don't know how much like she owned it and stuff, but I think that's really important that like, yeah, she was getting married young, but also at the same time, like this was an astute businesswoman who was like running the financial operations of like her father's business, and that he was like, you better make sure she carries this. And also I think insisting on that like 1 year engagement was really cool for the time. And I don't know, I really like him for that. It almost made me forgive him for the slapping. But I think it just kind of reminds me of something that like my dad would do, and I think that's just like really sweet. Given the scarcity of women who worked in the formal sector, let alone as photographers during the 1950s, Abban is remarkable. When she opened her studio in the Jamestown neighborhood of Accra in 1953, the 18-year-old newlywed had no idea her business was a few streets away from the popular Dio Gratias, the oldest studio in the city, owned by the renowned J.K. Bruce van de Prier. I'm so sorry, I can't pronounce that. Business had been brisk at Ansar Studios in Sekondi, but in an unfamiliar city, Felicia had a slow start. Feeling the need to be creative with a renowned competition close by, Felicia started taking self-portraits before going out to swanky political events with Robert, so she could display the photos in a glass case that divided the entryway, reception, and portrait stage of the studio. Opening the morning-afternoon event, the display at Day and Night Studio presented Felicia's renditions of the latest cloth or hairstyle. Part marketing strategy and self-promotion, the self-portraits collapse the subject-object dichotomy and show a vision of modernity decontextualized from the social event, but no less important. Simultaneous to her studio work, Abban was employed as a stringer photographer at Guinea Press Limited, the publishing house of Nkrumah's Conventions People Party that came to power at independence in 1957. That's just basically to say that she became the president's photographer, which I think did really well for her street cred. And obviously that is a connection that she would have got through her husband. But being able to display all these images from her before she's going to the social event was also just like living proof of the fact that like she was talented, she was skilled, and Dr. Bowles goes on to say, the display case furnished evidence of her social status and also assuaged doubts about her photography skills. This doubling effect of Abban as both subject and photographer expands the presentation of the self-portrait as a prototypical visual currency, a memento of studio experience that invited prospective clients to step inside, dress up, and pose for their own portraits. The looming studio entry sign, the self-referential display of portraits, nearby dressing room, and curtain backdrop filled with props are replete with Abban's visions of respectable femininity that is professional, photogenic, and stylized through affirmations that are urban, middle class, and cool. So basically, to unpack the next part, what Bowles is describing is that her photos helped people feel seen and a part of something bigger, that they belonged to the cool crowd and were a part of the latest trends. Basically, because she was also the subject and managed to do it so stylishly, she was able to form a sense of community and connection from the very intimate nature that is a self-portrait, but also create something that was aspirational, something that you would want to have, something that wasn't something you had already, which I think is essentially what a really good influencer does. It's this very delicate balance between aspiration and approachability. Like, you need to be real and close enough to feel relatable, to feel like someone I know, to feel like someone I can touch, but you also have to have something that I can't reach. as well, a quality that I want, and a quality or an aspect or a vibe that I can only attain through you, through knowing you, from buying from you, or interacting with you. Tanisha Ford argues that soul style, or the Afro look, is a window into imagined social change, feminine expressions, and a vision of African modernity. Using the iconic imagery of Angela Davis's Afro, the Black Panther's black leather, and, of course, the dashiki as examples of dress politics, Ford describes how women used fashion to embody sentiments about modernity, coolness, and being part of the in crowd. Abban photographs are a matrix of opportunities intertwined with imaginings of a hopeful and vibrant present. Most of the self-portraits infuse ideas of a present and future self, which is reflected in Abban's preference for taking portraits before going to town in order to cool to perfection. In earlier discussions on Ghanaian photography, Wendell describes cooling as the post-production tradition of photographic retouches, where the photographer brightens the whites of a subject's eyes or lightens the skin in black and white photographs to present a sophisticated and desirable subject. The aesthetic of this colorism, where lightening and brightening are considered beautiful, led me to ask Abban for clarity. Rather than thinking about post-production, Abban references the act of taking the picture. She describes cooling to perfection as the experience of going to the studio before a big night or event and purposely waiting for what's to come. Taking the time to stop by the studio, set the stage, and having an apprentice load the film was a savoring. It set the tone for the night, calmed her excitement, kept her from getting too giggy, and allowed her to freeze the anticipation. The photograph is in some ways better than the soiree, many of which Abban cannot now remember, yet the cultural memories of cooling are embedded in the recurring performance of self-portraits. Robert Farris Thompson describes coolness as an Afro-Atlantic aesthetic tradition, exemplified by well-timed aloofness, in situations where excitement and sentimentality are acceptable. The mask of coolness, praised in times of celebration more than in moments of distress, is a skilled playfulness with neutral body postures. It is what Rebecca Walker, in homage to Thompson, describes as black cool. And basically kind of like what I kind of get this is that like, and I guess it's kind of like why we're all attracted to like people who are nonchalant, like people who have an air and an ease about them. Because I think there is something about the fact that like when there is excitement, when there is a flurry of emotion and dizziness, to have one person who's in the middle of the room, eye of the storm, and just the center of stillness, who is so stationary despite all the exciting things going on, is inviting, it's and attractive. And I like to think that it offers an idea of security, because if you can be so cool and reserved and easy in an exciting and happy time, then perhaps they can also trust you to retain that same sense of like stability in a time of distress. And I think that is also what is inviting about like a very black idea of coolness, which I think is very hard to synthesize further than what they've described here, is this idea of like just keeping calm and having that ease. You know, when we think about these like sort of stereotypes or these like typifications of like what makes like blackness so interesting, so cool, it is that swagger, I guess. And I think it stands in such a great contrast into the kind of conditions a lot of black people go under. And I think that's what makes it so inviting and so attractive and so easy. And basically Bowles goes on to sort of describe the ways that like Abban is always purposefully posing herself in these ways that are very aloof, that are very relaxed, that are very at ease. Like she's never too eager. She's not really always looking directly to the camera. She's not looking for approval. Like she's inviting you in. She's actually like you're the one looking at her photographs, wanting to know more about her, about wanting to come into her world. And she does these very easy motions. She's, you know, relaxed in the shoulder, or she's looking away, or, you know, she's tilted to the right and she's got her shoulder up here, etc. And she's also positioning herself in a way that really expertly and subtly shows off what she's wearing as well. Like you get a really good glance. It's peak fashion photography, right? Like you like the way she's posing herself, like your eye is drawn to like the jewelry she's wearing, or the way like the pleats on her dress perfectly emphasize her figure, or how they draw eye to the head wrap and stuff. And she's just really thinking about cultivating an image, and there's so many different components of it. And it's interesting because obviously it takes a lot of skill and it takes a lot of practice and it takes a lot of thought, but then it gives you the overall effect of something that is so effortless and so easy. And I think that's something I mean, people spend billions of dollars to try and capture this, right? And it's something that's very hard to quantify or qualify in words, but it's something that I think we all know that we're naturally drawn to. I think that when a lot of us have to think about like, why do you like some of your favorite celebrities, or why do you like some of your favorite influencers? It's that exact vibe. But then you still have to do this and still be inviting and approachable as a person, which is a balance that I think like is what's the difference between sort of like celebrities and like influencers in that sense. And that like an influencer should still be like easy and cool, but in a way that makes you feel like you could also be really easy and cool. Her self-portraits assert a way of being in the world that camouflages the routine of everyday experiences. Her precise yet fluid social biography and her studio was a place to present the sociability, but also a space to participate, imagine, and anticipate what was yet to come. In this process, where copies of a self-portrait may have been sent to family on the coast or abroad after leaving the display case, Abban projects success through multiple performances. In many of the photographs, Abban wears her wedding ring, expensive clothes, and wigs to cultivate a polished ideal. Abban materializes coolness and grace that belie the challenging pressures she faced. Taken during the early years of her marriage, the photographs mask the struggles of multiple miscarriages, the precariousness of entrepreneurship, the travel demands of her husband's works, and the care of her two ailing children. Instead, Abban's self-portraits are the invention of a shape-shifting black woman, capable of maintaining the narrative of herself, while traveling multiple paths through multiple personas, roles, and circumstances. The photographs proclaim a presence to an unknowing but seeing public and act as a defense against vulnerability. So here, Bowles describes how Abban is utilizing her photography to position herself as cool, chic, and unbothered, while also facing extreme and like several tragedies and anxieties in her personal life, and essentially like using her art and her business as a shield. You know, she's able to take a hold of her reality, or at least within the confines of her studio, and find refuge from the stresses of life. And it reminds me of this interview that I had done last year with the photographer Trevor Stearman, whose work is also incredibly influenced and a natural descendant of African vernacular photography like Abban's. And one of my favorite parts of that interview was when Stearman mentioned how like the stylization and the glamour of photography this time, you know, it stands in stark contrast to like the political and social turmoil. And it wasn't just about like offering people like a sense of escape, but also a vision for like a better future. And I think that's what Abban's work was capturing brilliantly. Like, there is an element of fantasy and wish fulfillment in this, but it's also the idea of like, here is a way, like, you know, when you talk about like you want to put a feeling to words, like here's how you put a feeling to like something that you can see, which is something about Bowles mentions a little bit earlier in the essay about like this photography was also like a kind of visual language, and it was just a way to put into, I think, a way more understandable, a way more cross-cultural than words, to think about like who we could be, where we could go, and the things that we could do. And it's also one of my favorite things about looking at a lot of this photography. Like, I love mentioning how like when a couple of years ago when I was really getting into African fashion history, like I would show a bunch of my friends and my colleagues like all these old photographs, and a lot of them were just thinking about the fact that like, oh well, I can't find any joy in this image because it's like this was happening at a time of like police brutality and like apartheid and slavery, etc. But I'm just like, I think you also need to think about the fact that like when you look at these images, like people weren't just taking an image to take an image, you know what I mean? It's not like when you get photographed in the middle of the street during a protest or everyday life. Like when you went into a studio, you planned your outfits, you thought about it. You also had intentions with where this photo was going to go. It was going to go in a photo album. It was going to get sent to family members, as Bowles describes. It was supposed to be a really big, important part of your archive. And it was a chance for you to just completely shape who you were. So yeah, outside of the space of this photo, you know, you could be going through miscarriages. You could be having the worst time of your life. You could be broke as all hell. But in this photo, you are who you are according to who you think you are and who you want to be. And that's like the joy and like, I don't know, pleasure I find from seeing these things. And I think that's also something that I think, you know, I want to try and embody more, I think, because we take photography and like the fact that we can have so many images of ourselves for granted now. But also like using this as a chance to like really just, I hate saying this, but romanticize your life, you know. And I think that's a really big important part of like having the life you want, is being able to visualize it. Oh my god, I'm sounding really woo, but I think these are very important things, and I really just enjoy this aspect of Abban's work. And even just going back to this idea as well, when she sort of speaks about how like the getting ready for the event was more fun probably than the event, which I think is a common thing we all feel. Like, getting ready with your friends obviously is the most fun, probably more fun than like whatever you will do at the party. And it's because like when you're doing that little practice of like putting your makeup on and doing your hair, and you're like taking a little mirror selfie before you're doing a little get ready with me video, you know, you have the whole future ahead of you. And also in that moment, you're kind of in control of everything, right? Like, you're in control of how you feel and how you look. And you're also in control of like your perception of the night. And I like the idea of like taking this sort of throwaway activity and thinking of it as a bit of like an art form, even if it's just for like yourself or myself and like your own private space. But like, why not like use that as a time to really have fun with it? Like, I think the next time I'm like getting ready for an event, I'm gonna like look at some advanced photography, and I'm just gonna start posing myself in my room and put some lights on and really just like get something out of it. Because you know, you can always have a crappy night and think about how you should have stayed home, but at least the time you spent home, you had an absolute blast. I need to stop laughing at myself. It's not that funny. Ghana's domestic textile industry was well underway when Abban began taking self-portraits at her Accra studio. Few Ghanaians purchased wax print cloth ready to wear, but instead relied on tailors, seamstresses, and designers to make finished outfits. Cotton-based textiles such as wax and fancy prints were popular for working class consumption, but the nationalized market faced stiff competition from imported Dutch wax prints. For more than a century, Vlisco's patented wax hollandaise fabric has consistently been regarded as a luxury commodity, even amid the current boom of more affordable wax print copies from China. Through branding habits such as frequent pattern recoloring and marketing campaigns that launched the modeling craze of African women, Vlisco situates itself as a brand that is not selling a fabric, but an aesthetic experience that is both African and cosmopolitan and represents an individual and collective expression. One example is the popular Angelina pattern created by Vlisco designer Toon van der Manneke in 1962. Fashioned after an Ethiopian royal tunic, Angelina is one of the Dutch corporation's most popular patterns. Originally designed for the Indonesian market, Angelina is also called the Miriam Makeba, after the famed South African singer, or Addis Ababa, in homage to its urban capital of origin. Angelina is associated with a black global aesthetic, a particular kind of gendered modernization, affirmed by it being a cloth that bears a name because monikers are only given to visco fabrics with a long history of widespread appeal and status. Abban describes Angelina with such an affinity that the cloth could easily be mistaken for the name of a beloved person. Abban says Angelina is about looking sweet and sophisticated, and her self-portrait in Angelina lent a complex multiplicity to identity politics. The dynamic embodiment of the design means that by wearing Angelina, Abban herself is sweet and sophisticated, but she also guilefully uses her husband's textile networks to acquire the latest variations of Angelina before it arrived at the commercial market. Abban leveraged her social status amid the distribution channels of the factory and market in order to swiftly collaborate with a dressmaker before the print arrived at the market. This in turn made her self-portrait a prescient display of the latest Angelina design colors well ahead of the variation's arrival at the market. The self-portrait display and access to Angelina ahead of most Ghanaian women presents a visual voice of women's experiences in ways that extend sweetness and sophistication into power and status. The creative cut of the Angelina pattern, Abban's gold hoop earrings and wig, which replicate both the halo effect of an afro and coiffed coquettishness of Motown elegance, embody a subjectivity produced by a confluence of sensibilities that are flexible, cross-cultural, and mobile. Abban's wig is at once the product of a 1950s fashion craze in Accra that was spurred by an uptick in wig imports and the arrival of US magazines like Jet and Ebony that targeted black audiences. Abban is sure to maintain that her wig is not an imitation of foreign culture, but instead shows how tapped in she was to black trends. To further complicate the Angelina print, the cloth is also the foundational pattern for the wildly popular dashiki of the 1960s. In the same way, the black leather jacket has come to be seen as the uniform of the Black Panther Party, the dashiki, a loose-fitting tunic sewn from bright African prints, indicates an allegiance to Pan-African ideals on the African continent and in the diaspora, even if the rationale hinges on contradictory cultural cues. As a social aesthetic, Pan-Africanism was articulated through dress and style after the passage of the U.S. Civil Rights Act of 1964, when the dashiki was seen as a visual marker of racial solidarity and pride for African Americans. The shirt became a form of black protest, and dashiki-clad cultural nationalists typified the antithesis of the suit and tie integrationists. Although by the end of the 1960s, the dashiki was both an Afrocentric style and part of white hippie counterculture in the U.S. Abban adds, When someone looks at these pictures, they know who I am and they know that I am a good photographer. I take my time in dressing them. I make sure I look good so the customers know they will look good too. In her shift between describing her own photographs and the act of posing customers to look good, Abban explicitly imagines herself as her own client, fully aware that the cloth, the fashion design, and the idea of her self-portrait as a reflection of what everybody knows is a self-imaging that expresses a desired contemporaneity. Contemporaneity. Abban's self-portraits present an up-to-date fashion sensibility, and the brilliant hues of the bold pattern allow viewers to see the blues, greens, yellows, and browns in the sophisticated ensemble of Abban's Angelina. Black and white images do not diminish the vibrancy of the colors, and the photograph fuses fashion, art, and class politics in ways that are at once highly conventionalized within existing social structures about cloth, but in another way teases wax print cloth as part of global aesthetic. Adornment in Ghana has a history of laying identity claims through cloth, particularly during the period Abban was making self-portraits. For example, the attire of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah at Ghana's independence celebration is often recalled as a moment of ideological solidarity with Africans across the continent and the diaspora. Similar to the Abban self-portraits, the former president employed bodily practice as political praxis to make compelling visual statements about class and lay claim to a confident nationalist self. During the festivities, Nkrumah did not wear the revered hand-woven kente of Asante royalty. Instead, he, along with cabinet ministers, wore the batakari, a type of loose shirt typically found in the northern agricultural regions of the country. Nkrumah's choice symbolized the common man and celebrated indigenous styles during a time when Western-style dress was enormously popular. At other times, Nkrumah wore kente cloth during state affairs as a rejection of Western suits and neckties. Abban has the privilege of presenting both traditional and contemporary, blending old school with new imaginaries that accentuate her social and economic capital. Abban's depiction of clothing and style present an unfolding and evolving image of African beauty that contributes to the burgeoning discourse that counters the narrative of African women as passive photographic subjects. The self-portraits visually memorialize Abban to both insider and outsider, archive her social position as a pioneering Ghanaian woman photographer, and unpack how photographs are used to articulate the powerful influence of dress on the social imagination. Within African studies, scholars lament the challenges of preservation and access related to African photography, as well as how the construction of meaning around images largely hinges on the way in which a photograph circulates. From the earliest photographic encounter, scholars have long held interest in the way photographs shaped colonial and post-colonial imaginings of Africa, from the strange, intoxicating, carnal, primitive wild to the traveling exhibition of Sarah Bartman, world fairs, and museum collections. Through the construction of colonial subjects as others, photographs played an integral role in situating African bodies as subjects of technologies rather than as producers. In one way, this exploration of the sensuous aesthetics of Abban self-portraits provide a much-needed critique about the intentionality of a woman photographer and her self-portraits from the mid-20th century in Ghana. In another way, through the lens of beauty aesthetics, Abban's portraits are discursive commentaries that enliven our understanding about femininity and portraiture in Ghana. It wasn't that great. So after reading all of that, I think her life and career really remind me of something Chris Kraus wrote in her book, I Love Dick, which is like my favorite book of all time. There's not enough female irrepressibility written down. I fused my silence and repression with the entire female gender silence and repression. I think the sheer fact of women talking, being paradoxical, inexplicable, flipped, self-destructive, but above all else public is the most revolutionary thing in the world. And now to pretend that this is book club, I have some questions for the culture. Number one, I would love to know if anyone else is familiar or had been familiar with Abban's work or seen any of her images before. So obviously this essay primarily focused on her self-portraiture, but obviously she had a studio where she was taking photos of other people, which I have included throughout this, I hope. And she also worked for the president at the time, and I think she was also doing like street and life photography, some of which is featured in that exhibition. I will include like links to all the other articles and things I found on her for you to check out if you haven't seen her stuff. But yeah, just be curious, especially from anyone from Ghana, like how familiar you are with her work. Is this a female photographer any of you guys have studied, especially if you do study like African media and visual culture? Also on the subject of self-portraiture, a few days ago, actually I think a couple weeks ago, an artist I really admire, Kenyamzi, had posed this question: what happens to art when attention becomes the currency?
I'm scared that the celebritization of artists hand in hand with how social media works right now, created this shift and focus on optics and aesthetics. And I'm scared that that creates a dilution of the work. I'm scared that it impacts and punishes the depth of work.
And basically in this video, she talks about how a lot of work has become secondary to the persona. It's about looking like an artist than it is doing the work of being an artist. And I think Abban is perhaps an interesting way to reconsider or reconcile this. Like, I have a lot of artist friends, and they're all very talented and skilled as musicians, painters, photographers, etc. And a lot of them are very frustrated with having to perform for social media and this attention economy. And while I get it, like, it really sucks to pour so much of yourself into a painting or a garment or like a song, and then have to also do the additional dog and pony show of like getting likes and comments online. I do also think that a lot of us could stand to reframe our thinking from this. Like, there's something I actually also got from another video from another artist friend of mine, where he basically spoke about how instead of looking at content creation as having to bend to the will of the algorithm and sell yourself doing these trends and these little dances, that you can approach making content in the same way that you do your art.
I think it's okay to be a musician who wears many hats. Many of us complain because we only signed up to be musicians. We didn't sign up to be marketers or content creators. And I'm not very good or comfortable with doing either, but I don't actually mind. I'm a creative person, and rather than thinking of this as something that I'm forced to do, I see it as a new avenue to express my creativity. Right now, video editing is that avenue. I don't know much about it, and I think it's kind of funny being bad at it, but doing it anyway. This is just a means to an end. It doesn't have to meet the same standards that I set for my music. I believe that creating is only half the joy. The other half is in sharing it. It's in connecting with people who see themselves in the work that you do. We as musicians now wear many hats. Does that have to be a bad thing?
Like, consider each reel or carousel another way to further exercise your creative muscles and demonstrate your unique voice and style. And I know it's icky, at least for me, to think about like the commercial aspect to what you do, but that is the reality. And what I really enjoyed about reading about Felicia Abban, is that also, like, what was also a marketing strategy for her also turned out to be something that was very empowering and uplifting, and a big part of like her art and her oeuvre, and a significant part of why her legacy is her legacy. Like, the commerce doesn't always have to be so antithetical or so opposing to the art itself. So for any artists, writers, content creators, and creatives in the audience, I'd love to hear about how you manage this tension between self-promotion and the work, and if this is even a thing we should be navigating. You know, I think sometimes we often talk about how like artists shouldn't have to also be like, you know, marketers and business people, but unfortunately that is kind of the world we live in. And on one hand, I love talking about the way things shouldn't be, but I also love to have pragmatic, practical solutions. And I think it'd be really cool as a fun little discussion point for us to all talk about the different ways we will navigate that. And this is like the fourth time I've recorded this. My voice is freaking out. And my computer has been shutting down like 6 times, and now I'm gonna go edit this. But anyway, if you would like to support me and the work that I do, you are welcome to become a member of my Patreon, or you can make a donation of any amount to my Buy Me a Coffee account. Everything is linked below. You can also follow me on Instagram and TikTok, where I am at OKBodyK. I'm going to have a bunch of cough syrup and then sit in front of the computer and edit everything now. Oh, I really hate winter so much. Like, this is the worst season.